The morning sun barely touched the windows of Kensington Palace when Catherine woke up. Her eyes were already red from crying the night before. She looked at William sleeping next to her and felt her heart break all over again. Today was the day they had been dreading for weeks. Today they would say goodbye to someone who meant the world to them. William stirred and opened his eyes. When he saw Catherine's face, he knew she had been awake for hours. He reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. They didn't need words. They both knew what this day would bring. The pain of loss was written all over their faces. The palace was unusually quiet that morning. Even the staff moved around like ghosts, trying not to disturb the heavy silence that filled every room. Catherine got out of bed slowly and walked to the window. She looked out at the gardens where so many happy memories had been made. Now those memories felt like they belonged to a different lifetime. William joined her at the window and wrapped his arms around her from behind. They stood there together, watching the world wake up while their own world felt like it was falling apart. Catherine leaned back against him and let the tears fall freely. She had tried to be strong for so long, but today she couldn't pretend anymore. The children were still sleeping in their rooms. George, Charlotte, and Louis had no idea how much their lives were about to change. Catherine worried about them constantly. How do you explain such a profound loss to young children? How do you help them understand when you can barely understand it yourself? William had been thinking about the same thing. As a father, he wanted to protect his children from all the pain in the world. But this was one thing he couldn't shield them from. This loss would touch all of their lives in ways they couldn't even imagine yet. Catherine walked to her closet and pulled out a black dress. She had hoped she would never have to wear it. When she bought it months ago, she prayed it would just hang there unused. But life had other plans. She held the dress against herself and looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked tired and broken. William dressed quietly in his formal attire. His military training had taught him to push through difficult moments, but this was different. This wasn't a duty or a ceremony. This was personal. This was family. He adjusted his tie 3 times before getting it right. His hands were shaking slightly, something that rarely happened to him. A soft knock on the door interrupted their quiet preparation. It was one of the palace staff bringing tea. Catherine thanked her with a weak smile, but the tea sat untouched on the table. Neither of them could think about eating or drinking. Their stomachs were in knots. William sat down on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. Catherine had seen him stressed before, but this was different. He looked defeated. She sat next to him and put her arm around his shoulders. For once, she was the one offering comfort instead of needing it. They talked quietly about the day ahead. There would be so many people, so many eyes watching them. The world would see their grief on display. Catherine hated that part of royal life. Even in the most private moments of pain, they had to share it with millions of strangers. William reminded her that those people cared. They were mourning too. The person they were losing today wasn't just important to their family. This person had touched lives across the entire nation and beyond. That thought brought both comfort and more sadness. Catherine walked to the children's rooms one by one. She peeked in at each sleeping child. George was sprawled across his bed with his favorite stuffed animal. Charlotte slept peacefully with a small smile on her face. Louis was curled up in a tiny ball, looking so innocent and small. Catherine's heart ached thinking about waking them up to face this sad day. She decided to let them sleep a little longer. They would need their rest for what was coming. The day would be long and emotionally draining for everyone, but especially for the children. They were too young to fully grasp what was happening, but old enough to feel the weight of everyone's sadness. William joined Catherine in the hallway outside the children's rooms. They stood together in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second bringing them closer to the moment they were dreading. Time felt cruel. It kept moving forward when all they wanted was to go back. Catherine thought about all the conversations she wished she had. All the things she never got to say. There were so many questions she wanted to ask, so much advice she still needed. Now those opportunities were gone forever. The finality of it all felt crushing. William was thinking about the same things. He remembered the last time they had all been together. Everyone had been laughing and happy. He wished he had known it would be the last time. He would have paid more attention. He would have remembered every detail. Instead, that day had seemed ordinary, just like any other day. The palace staff began arriving for the day. They moved quietly through the halls, preparing everything for the formal proceedings that would take place later. Catherine could hear their hushed voices and gentle footsteps. Everyone was trying so hard to be respectful of the family's grief. William received a phone call updating him on the arrangements. He listened carefully and gave instructions in a steady voice, but Catherine could see the pain in his eyes. He was doing what he always did, putting duty first even when his heart was breaking. She admired his strength but wished he would let himself fall apart just for a moment. As the morning light grew stronger, Catherine knew they couldn't put it off any longer. It was time to wake the children. It was time to begin this difficult day. She took a deep breath and looked at William. He nodded and took her hand. Together, they would face this. Together, they would get through it somehow. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on both of them. But in that moment, standing hand in hand in the quiet hallway of their home, they found a small measure of strength in each other. Whatever happened today, whatever pain they had to endure, they would not face it alone. Catherine opened George's door first. He was the oldest and would understand more than his younger siblings. She sat on the edge of his bed and gently touched his shoulder. George opened his eyes and immediately saw his mother's sad face. His smile faded quickly. William came in and sat on the other side of the bed. George sat up and looked between his parents. He was only young, but he was smart enough to know something serious was happening. The boy's eyes filled with worry as he waited for them to speak. Catherine struggled to find the right words. How do you tell your child about loss? How do you explain that someone they love won't be coming back? She opened her mouth several times but couldn't make the words come out. Finally, William spoke softly, explaining as gently as he could. George's face crumpled as he understood what his father was saying. Tears started rolling down his cheeks. Catherine pulled him into a tight hug while her own tears fell into his hair. William wrapped his arms around both of them. They stayed like that for several minutes, crying together as a family. Charlotte woke up to the sound of crying coming from her brother's room. She got out of bed and padded down the hallway in her pajamas. When she walked into George's room and saw everyone crying, she started crying too, even though she didn't fully understand why. Catherine reached out and pulled her into the embrace. Louis was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the sadness filling his home. Catherine made the decision to let him sleep a bit longer. He was so young. Maybe he could have just a few more minutes of innocence before the weight of this day touched him too. The family sat together on George's bed for a long time. Catherine and William answered the children's questions as best they could. George wanted to know why this had happened. Charlotte asked if the person was in heaven now. Their innocent questions made the situation even harder to bear. William tried to explain in words the children could understand. He talked about memories and love lasting forever. He promised them that even though someone was gone, the love they shared would never disappear. Catherine nodded along, trying to be strong for her children even though she felt like she was breaking inside. Eventually, they had to get the children ready. There were clothes laid out for them, somber outfits chosen carefully for this sad occasion. Charlotte didn't want to wear her black dress. She said it was too sad. Catherine knelt down and held her daughter's hands, explaining gently why today was different from other days. George dressed himself quietly. He had become very serious, trying to act older than his years. Catherine's heart ached watching him grow up too fast in this moment. Children shouldn't have to face such heavy sadness so young, but life didn't always protect children from pain. Louis finally woke up and immediately sensed something was wrong. The little boy looked around at everyone's sad faces with confusion. Catherine picked him up and held him close, breathing in his baby smell and wishing she could keep him this small and innocent forever. William helped explain things to Louis in the simplest way possible. The palace staff had prepared breakfast, but no one had much appetite. They sat together at the table, pushing food around their plates. The silence was broken only by occasional sniffles and the quiet clink of silverware. Even the children, who were usually full of energy in the mornings, sat quietly. Catherine kept looking at the clock. Each passing minute brought them closer to the formal farewell. She dreaded it, but also wanted it to be over. The anticipation was almost worse than the event itself. Her stomach churned with anxiety and grief mixed together. William made several phone calls, coordinating with family members and officials. Catherine could hear his voice from the next room, steady and professional. But when he came back to the table, she could see how much that composure was costing him. His eyes looked tired and old. Charlotte climbed into her mother's lap and asked if they could stay home instead. Catherine wished they could. She wished they could all hide away in the palace and pretend this day wasn't happening. But they couldn't. They had responsibilities. They had a duty to honor someone who meant so much to so many people. George asked if he would have to speak in front of people. William assured him that he didn't have to say anything if he didn't want to. All they had to do was be there and say their private goodbyes. That seemed to make George feel a little better, though he still looked nervous. The royal advisors began arriving to brief William and Catherine on the day's schedule. They spoke in hushed, respectful tones, going over timing and protocols. Catherine tried to pay attention but found her mind wandering. How could anyone think about schedules and protocols at a time like this? She excused herself and went to the bathroom. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Her face looked pale and drawn. She applied some makeup, trying to look presentable for the cameras that would be waiting outside. But no amount of makeup could hide the grief in her eyes. William came to check on her. He found her standing at the sink, staring at her reflection with tears streaming down her face. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and met her eyes in the mirror. They stood like that for a moment, drawing strength from each other's presence. Catherine turned around and buried her face in William's chest. He held her tightly, stroking her hair and letting her cry. He was crying too. The strong prince who always had to be composed was finally letting his own pain show in this private moment with his wife. They talked about their fears for the day ahead. Catherine worried about breaking down in public. William worried about the children seeing so much sadness. They both worried about getting through the ceremony without falling apart completely. These fears felt heavy and overwhelming. A gentle knock on the door reminded them that time was moving forward. They had to finish getting ready. They had to pull themselves together enough to face what was coming. Catherine wiped her eyes and took several deep breaths. William straightened his jacket and tried to compose his features. They returned to the children who were being looked after by their nanny. George, Charlotte, and Louis all looked up when their parents entered. The children seemed scared and uncertain. Catherine and William sat down with them one more time before they had to leave. William spoke to them about being brave. He explained that it was okay to cry and be sad, but they also needed to remember all the happy times. He wanted them to focus on good memories rather than just the sadness of goodbye. The children nodded, trying their best to understand. Charlotte held her mother's hand tightly and wouldn't let go. Louis climbed into his father's arms and tucked his head under William's chin. George stood close to his parents, trying to be strong but clearly fighting back more tears. The family huddled together, taking comfort in their closeness. The time had come. They could delay no longer. The cars were waiting outside. Thousands of people were gathering to pay their respects. The world was watching and waiting. Catherine felt her heart racing as they prepared to leave the safety and privacy of their home. William helped the children into their coats. Catherine gathered her purse and gloves with trembling hands. She looked around their home one more time as if trying to memorize this moment. After today, nothing would be quite the same. This goodbye would change their family forever. They walked to the door together. William paused with his hand on the handle. He looked back at Catherine and she saw all the love and pain in his eyes. She nodded, telling him without words that she was ready, or as ready as she would ever be. He opened the door and they stepped out into the day that would test their strength in ways they never imagined. The moment they stepped outside, camera flashes went off like lightning. Even though Catherine had expected it, the intensity still shocked her. She instinctively pulled Charlotte closer and reached for George's hand. William carried Louis while keeping one protective hand on George's shoulder. Together they walked toward the waiting cars. The crowd that had gathered outside the palace gates was enormous. Thousands of people stood in respectful silence, many holding flowers and candles. Some were crying openly. Others simply stood with their heads bowed. The sight of so much collective grief made Catherine's eyes well up again. Getting into the car felt like stepping into a different world. The door closed, muffling the sounds from outside. Inside it was quiet except for Louis's soft whimpers. He didn't like all the cameras and people. Catherine smoothed his hair and whispered soothing words while her own heart raced with anxiety. The drive through London was unlike anything they had experienced before. Every street was lined with mourners. People had traveled from all over the country just to be present for this moment. Some threw flowers toward the car as it passed. Others held up signs with heartfelt messages. The outpouring of love was overwhelming. Charlotte pressed her face against the window, watching all the people. She asked her mother why everyone looked so sad. Catherine explained that the person they were saying goodbye to was loved by many, many people. Not just their family, but the whole nation felt this loss deeply. Charlotte seemed to understand a little better. George sat very still and quiet. He stared straight ahead, his young face trying hard to look brave. Catherine recognized that expression. She had seen William wear it many times when he was trying to hold himself together. Her son was learning too young what it meant to grieve in public. William kept checking on everyone, making sure the children were okay. But Catherine could see the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped his knees. He was holding on by a thread. She reached over and placed her hand on his. He looked at her with eyes full of unshed tears and squeezed her hand back. As they got closer to their destination, the crowds grew even larger. The car slowed to a crawl. Catherine could see people of all ages, from elderly folks to young children, all gathered to pay their respects. The love and support were touching, but it also made the loss feel more real and more final. They arrived at the location where the formal ceremony would take place. The building stood grand and solemn against the gray sky. Catherine had been here many times before for happy occasions. Now it would forever be connected in her mind with this sad day. Some places get marked by grief and you can never see them the same way again. Security helped them out of the car. The flashes started again, even more intense than before. Catherine held Charlotte's hand tightly. William guided George while still carrying Louis. They moved as one unit, a family bound together by love and shared sorrow. The walk to the entrance felt impossibly long. Inside, other family members were already waiting. When Catherine saw them, her carefully maintained composure cracked. Seeing the pain on other familiar faces made her own grief surge up like a wave. She embraced family members with tears streaming down her face. There was no need to hide or pretend anymore. They were all hurting together. William greeted family members with quiet dignity, but his voice kept breaking. Charlotte clung to her mother's dress, overwhelmed by seeing so many adults crying. George stood close to his father, watching everything with wide, serious eyes. Louis started crying because everyone else was crying and the emotion in the room was too much for his little heart. An advisor approached William to discuss final arrangements. Catherine watched her husband nod and respond appropriately while his world was falling apart. This was what royal life demanded. Even in the deepest grief, there were protocols and duties. She hated it sometimes, but she also admired William's ability to carry on. They were guided to a private room to wait before the ceremony began. It was just their immediate family now. Catherine sank into a chair and pulled Louis onto her lap. Charlotte leaned against her mother's side. George sat next to William, and father and son looked remarkably similar in that moment, both trying so hard to be strong. William suggested they share some memories. He wanted the children to remember the happy times, not just this sad day. George was the first to speak, talking about a funny story that made even Charlotte giggle a little. Then Charlotte shared her favorite memory. Even Louis contributed in his simple way. As they shared memories, some of the heaviness in the room lifted just slightly. Laughter mixed with tears. Catherine loved hearing her children talk about someone who had meant so much to them. These were the stories they would carry forward. These memories would become treasures to hold on to. But then it was time. An official knocked on the door and told them the ceremony was about to begin. Catherine felt her stomach drop. This was it. The final goodbye was moments away. She looked at William and he looked back at her with an expression that mirrored her own fear and sadness. They stood and arranged themselves. William adjusted George's collar. Catherine straightened Charlotte's dress. They picked up Louis together. Then as a family they walked toward the doors that would lead them to the ceremony. Each step felt heavy, like walking through water. The doors opened and they entered a space filled with people. Every seat was taken. Important figures from around the world had come to pay their respects. The sight of so many people all gathered for this one purpose was staggering. Catherine's legs felt weak, but she kept walking. Music played softly, a hymn that had always been a favorite. Hearing it now in this context made it sound completely different. Catherine would never be able to hear that song again without remembering this moment. Some songs become forever linked to loss. They took their places in the front row. Catherine sat between William and Charlotte, with George on William's other side and Louis on Catherine's lap. The children were remarkably well behaved, sensing the importance of the moment. Even Louis stayed quiet, though he squirmed occasionally in his mother's arms. The ceremony began with prayers and readings. Catherine tried to focus on the words, but her mind kept drifting. She thought about all the times that would never come now, all the future moments this person would miss, birthdays, holidays, graduations, weddings. The list of everything that was lost felt endless. Speakers came forward to share tributes. Some stories made people smile through their tears. Others were so touching that soft crying could be heard throughout the space. Catherine listened to story after story about someone she loved, each one revealing another layer of a remarkable life lived. When it was William's turn to speak, Catherine held her breath. She knew how hard this would be for him. He walked to the front with his head held high, but she could see his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the paper with his prepared words. He began to speak, and his voice was strong at first, but as William continued, his voice started to waver. He paused several times to compose himself. Catherine watched him struggle, wanting to rush to his side but knowing he needed to do this. Then his voice broke completely and he stopped speaking. The silence in the room was absolute. Catherine saw her husband's shoulders shake. He was crying openly now, unable to continue. Without thinking, she stood up and walked to him. She placed her hand on his back, offering her support and presence. He looked at her with gratitude and tears running down his face. Together they stood there for a moment, united in their grief. William managed to finish his tribute with Catherine standing beside him. His words were powerful and full of love. When he was done, they walked back to their seats together. The children looked up at their parents with concern, but also with understanding that was beyond their years. Grief was teaching them lessons no child should have to learn so young. The ceremony continued with more readings and prayers. Catherine held William's hand tightly, and he held hers just as firmly. They were anchoring each other through this storm of emotion. Charlotte had fallen asleep against her mother's side, exhausted from all the feelings. Even in sleep, her little face looked sad. George sat up straight, watching everything with intense focus. He seemed to be trying to remember every detail. Catherine wondered what was going through his young mind. Was he scared? Confused? Sad? Probably all of those things and more. She wished she could take away his pain. But grief was something everyone had to feel in their own way. Louis had started fussing, so William took him and walked quietly to the back of the room. Catherine watched them go, her heart breaking for her husband who was trying so hard to be a good father while dealing with his own overwhelming sadness. She saw him bounce Louis gently while his own tears fell silently. The final prayers were said. The last song was sung. Then came the moment Catherine had been dreading most. It was time for the family to say their private goodbyes. Her heart started racing so fast she thought everyone could hear it. She gently woke Charlotte and helped her stand. George took his mother's hand without being asked. They moved forward as a family. Each step felt impossibly difficult. Catherine's legs were shaking. Her vision blurred with tears. But she kept moving because she had to. This was the last chance to say goodbye. The very last time. After this, there would be no more opportunities. When they reached the front, Catherine felt like she couldn't breathe. The finality of it all crashed over her like a wave. This was real. This was happening. There was no going back or changing it. The person she loved was truly gone, and all that was left was saying farewell. William stood beside her, and she could feel him trembling. He reached out with one hand while holding Louis with the other. George pressed against his father's leg. Charlotte held onto Catherine's dress so tightly her little knuckles were white. They stood there as a family, united in their grief. Catherine leaned forward and whispered words that were meant only for the person she was saying goodbye to. She told them how much they were loved, how much they would be missed, how the hole they left behind could never be filled. The words came between sobs, broken and raw and honest. William spoke next, his voice barely above a whisper. He thanked them for everything they had given the family, for the love, the guidance, the support. He promised to honor their memory and make them proud. His voice cracked on the last words, and he had to stop speaking as emotion overwhelmed him. Charlotte didn't understand everything that was happening, but she blew a kiss. It was such an innocent, pure gesture that it made several people around them start crying harder. George stood silently with tears running down his face, looking much older than his years. Even Louis seemed to sense something important was happening. They stood there for several long minutes. No one rushed them. This was their time to grieve as a family, to say the things that needed to be said, to try to find some sense of closure even though closure seemed impossible. Catherine didn't want to leave. Walking away would make it final, but eventually they had to step back. Other family members needed their turn to say goodbye. William gently guided everyone back to their seats. Catherine looked back over her shoulder, not wanting to take her eyes away. It felt like abandonment to walk away, even though she knew she had no choice. They sat back down and watched as other family members took their turns. Each person's grief was unique and yet familiar. Everyone was losing someone important. Everyone was facing the same crushing sadness. It was a shared pain that somehow made it both easier and harder to bear. The ceremony finally drew to a close. More prayers were said, final words were spoken, then people began to file out slowly. Catherine and William stayed seated with their children. They weren't ready to leave yet. This place right now was the last connection to the person they loved. An advisor approached quietly and asked if they were ready. William nodded, though his face said he wasn't ready at all. Catherine gathered Charlotte into her arms. George stood and took his father's free hand. Together, slowly, they stood and prepared to leave. Walking out felt like the hardest thing Catherine had ever done. Each step took her further from the person she loved, further into a future that would be forever changed by this loss. Her feet felt like lead weights. Her heart felt like it was being ripped out of her chest. Outside, the crowds had grown even larger. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows. People held candles and flowers. Some reached out as the family passed, offering words of comfort and support. Catherine tried to smile and acknowledge them, but her face couldn't quite manage it. Getting back into the car felt like entering a different world again. The door closed, and suddenly they were isolated from all those people. It was just the five of them again. Charlotte immediately curled up on her mother's lap. George leaned against William. Louis had fallen asleep, worn out from the emotional day. No one spoke during the drive back. There were no words big enough for what they were feeling. Catherine stared out the window, watching London pass by in a blur of lights and shadows. The city looked the same as it always did, but everything felt different now. When they arrived back at the palace, the children were taken upstairs by their nanny. They needed to be fed and put to bed. It had been an impossibly long and difficult day for young children. Catherine hugged each one tightly before letting them go. She wanted to tuck them in herself, but she also needed a moment to fall apart. William and Catherine found themselves alone in their private sitting room. The silence was deafening. For hours they had been surrounded by people and noise. Now in the quiet, the reality of their loss hit even harder. They sat down on the sofa, and Catherine immediately broke down sobbing. William pulled her close and held her while she cried. Then he started crying too. They clung to each other like they were drowning, which in a way they were. Drowning in grief and sadness and the unfairness of loss. There was no one watching now. No cameras or crowds. Just two people mourning together. They talked about the ceremony. About how hard it had been. About William's moment when he couldn't continue speaking. Catherine told him she was proud of him for getting through it. He told her he couldn't have done it without her support. They reminded each other that they were a team. Hours passed as they sat together, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, sometimes crying, sometimes just holding each other. The palace staff quietly left food outside their door, but neither of them could eat. Grief had stolen their appetite for anything except comfort and closeness. Eventually, exhaustion started to set in. The emotional toll of the day had drained them completely. But neither wanted to go to bed. Sleep meant the day was over. It meant waking up tomorrow to a world where this loss was real and permanent. Staying awake felt like holding on to something, even though they knew they couldn't stop time. William finally stood and held out his hand to Catherine. They needed to check on the children and try to get some rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be more grieving to do, more adjusting to this new reality. But tonight, they had made it through the hardest day. They had said their goodbyes. As they climbed the stairs together, Catherine realized something. The person they lost would always be with them in spirit, in memories and stories. in the values they had instilled and the love they had shared. Death had taken away a physical presence, but it couldn't take away the impact of a life well lived. That realization didn't make the pain less, but it offered a tiny bit of comfort in an ocean of sadness. The next morning came too quickly. Catherine woke up with swollen eyes and a headache from crying so much. For a brief moment after waking, she forgot what had happened. Then reality crashed back down on her, and the pain felt fresh all over again. Yesterday hadn't been a nightmare. It had been real. William was already awake, staring at the ceiling. He looked like he hadn't slept much. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. When Catherine reached for his hand, he turned to look at her. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. They both knew they were facing the same empty feeling. The sound of children's voices drifted in from the hallway. George, Charlotte, and Louis were awake and asking for their parents. Catherine forced herself to get out of bed even though her body felt heavy as stone. The children needed them. Life kept going even when it felt like it should stop. When they opened the bedroom door, all three children rushed in. Charlotte climbed into bed between her parents. George sat at the foot of the bed. Louis toddled over to William and raised his arms to be picked up. The family stayed in bed together for a while, just being close. George asked if they were going to be sad forever. The question broke Catherine's heart. She tried to explain that the sadness would get easier over time, but they would always miss the person they lost. She told him that missing someone was a way of showing how much you loved them. George nodded, trying to understand concepts that even adults struggled with. Charlotte wanted to know if they could visit the person in heaven. Catherine pulled her daughter close and explained that they couldn't visit, but they could keep the person alive in their hearts by remembering all the good times. She said that every time they thought about a happy memory, it was like having a little visit. The children had so many questions. Some were simple, others were profound. Catherine and William answered as honestly as they could while still keeping things appropriate for young minds. It was exhausting but also necessary. The children needed to process what had happened in their own way. Breakfast was quiet. The palace staff moved around gently, speaking in soft voices. Even Louis seemed subdued, picking at his food without his usual enthusiasm. The family sat together at the table, each lost in their own thoughts while also being aware of everyone else's sadness. After breakfast, Catherine suggested they spend some time looking at old photos. She wanted the children to remember the happy moments. They gathered in the family room, and William brought out photo albums that hadn't been opened in years. Dust covered some of the older ones. As they looked through the photos, something beautiful happened. The children started smiling and even laughing at funny pictures. They pointed out silly faces and remembered stories connected to each image. The sadness didn't disappear, but it mixed with joy in a way that felt healing. William found a video on his phone from a family gathering a few months earlier. Everyone crowded around to watch. Hearing the person's voice and seeing them move and laugh was both wonderful and heartbreaking. Catherine cried while also smiling. It was possible to feel two opposite things at the same time. George asked if they could make a special memory book. He wanted to collect photos and write down stories so they would never forget. Catherine thought it was a beautiful idea. William agreed immediately. They spent the rest of the morning starting the project together as a family. Charlotte picked her favorite photos and explained why each one was special to her. George wrote down memories in his careful handwriting. Even Louis helped by pointing at pictures. Catherine and William worked alongside their children, grateful for something positive to focus on. As they worked, Catherine realized the children were teaching them how to grieve. Kids had a way of mixing sadness with joy that adults often forgot. They could cry one minute and laugh the next. They could miss someone terribly while also celebrating the time they had together. It was a healthier approach than drowning in only sadness. That afternoon, they went for a walk in the palace gardens. The fresh air felt good after being inside for so long. Charlotte ran ahead, picking flowers. George walked between his parents, holding both their hands. William carried Louis, who pointed at birds and clouds. Nature had a way of putting things in perspective. The trees didn't care about loss. The flowers kept blooming. The birds kept singing. Life went on all around them, reminding them that they too would find a way to keep going. Not right away and not without pain, but eventually. They found a quiet bench under a large tree. The same tree where so many family photos had been taken over the years. Catherine sat down and pulled Charlotte onto her lap. William sat next to her with Louis. George leaned against his mother's shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, just being together. William spoke softly about how proud he thought the person they lost would be of their family. How they would want everyone to remember the love and not just the sadness. Catherine nodded, knowing he was right but still feeling the heavy weight of grief on her chest. As the sun began to set, they headed back inside. The children needed dinner and baths. Normal routines had to continue. Catherine found comfort in the ordinary tasks. Making sure the children brushed their teeth and put on pajamas gave her something concrete to focus on. Tucking the children into bed that night took longer than usual. Each one needed extra hugs and reassurances. Charlotte asked if angels were real. George wanted to know if people in heaven could see them. Louis just wanted his mother to stay until he fell asleep. Catherine and William divided their time between all 3 rooms, making sure each child felt secure. When the children were finally asleep, Catherine and William returned to their own room. They were exhausted in every possible way, emotionally drained, physically tired, mentally worn out. But there was also a small sense of accomplishment. They had made it through another day. They talked about how well the children were handling everything. George's idea for the memory book had been inspired. Charlotte's ability to find joy even in sadness was remarkable. Louis's innocent presence reminded them that life continued with new beginnings even as others ended. Catherine admitted that she had been worried about breaking down completely in front of the children. William confessed the same fear, but they agreed that maybe it was okay for the children to see their parents grieve. It taught them that feeling sad was normal and nothing to be ashamed of. They discussed the days ahead. There would be more difficult moments. Holidays would be hard. Birthdays and anniversaries would bring fresh waves of sadness. But they would face those challenges together as a family. They would support each other through every difficult moment. William reminded Catherine of something the person they lost had once said. That family was everything. That love was the most important legacy anyone could leave. Those words felt especially meaningful now. They had been left with an incredible legacy of love, and it was their job to carry it forward. As they prepared for bed, Catherine felt a tiny shift inside herself. The overwhelming grief was still there, but underneath it she could feel something else, gratitude for the time they had, appreciation for the memories made, love that would never die even though the person was gone. She knew the pain would come in waves. Some days would be harder than others. There would be moments when the loss felt fresh all over again. But there would also be moments of peace, times when memories brought smiles instead of tears, days when life felt possible again. William held Catherine close as they lay in bed. Neither of them spoke. Words weren't necessary anymore. They had said everything that needed to be said over the past 2 days. Now they just needed rest and the comfort of each other's presence. Catherine closed her eyes and thought about the person they had said goodbye to. She silently promised to honor their memory by living fully and loving deeply, by raising her children with the same values she had been taught, by finding joy even in the midst of sorrow. Tomorrow would be another day of grieving and healing, but tonight she had made it through. They all had, and somehow that felt like enough. Weeks passed slowly. Each day brought new challenges and small victories. Catherine found herself crying at unexpected moments. A song on the radio, a smell that triggered a memory, a phrase someone said that the lost loved one used to say. Grief had a way of sneaking up when least expected. William threw himself into work perhaps too much. Catherine recognized it as his way of coping. When he was busy with royal duties, he didn't have to think about the pain. But she worried about him bottling everything up inside. One evening, she gently confronted him about it. At first, William insisted he was fine, but Catherine knew him too well. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was looking, the forced smile he wore in public. Finally, he broke down and admitted how much he was struggling. They stayed up late that night talking, really talking, about their feelings and fears, about how hard it was to grieve while also being parents and public figures, about feeling guilty when they had moments of happiness, about worrying they would forget important details as time passed. Catherine shared her own struggles, how she sometimes felt angry at the unfairness of loss, how she worried about the children growing up without someone so important in their lives, how she wished for just one more conversation, one more hug, one more chance to say all the things left unsaid. William listened and held her hand. He admitted he felt the same anger and regret. They cried together and found comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their feelings. Sharing the burden made it somehow lighter, even if only slightly. The children continued to process their grief in their own ways. George had taken to drawing pictures of memories. His bedroom walls were covered with artwork showing happy times. Charlotte talked about the person they lost constantly, keeping them alive through stories. Louis was too young to fully understand, but he often asked when they were coming back. One afternoon, Charlotte said something that stopped Catherine in her tracks. She asked if it was okay to be happy sometimes, or if being happy meant they didn't miss the person anymore. Catherine knelt down to her daughter's level and explained that the person they lost would want them to be happy. She told Charlotte that loving someone and missing them didn't mean you had to be sad all the time. In fact, the best way to honor someone's memory was to live a good life full of love and happiness. Charlotte seemed relieved by this answer, as if she had been carrying guilt about her moments of joy. That conversation made Catherine think. She realized she had been feeling guilty too. Guilty when she laughed. Guilty when she went a few hours without thinking about their loss. Guilty for starting to adjust to this new reality. But guilt wasn't what the lost loved one would have wanted. Catherine decided to make a conscious effort to embrace moments of happiness, to see them not as betrayals of grief but as celebrations of life. She started pointing out beautiful things to the children again. They went on small adventures. They had movie nights and game nights. Life slowly started feeling less heavy. The memory book George had started became a family project. They added to it regularly. New photos they found, stories other family members shared, drawings and notes from the children. It became a treasured collection that they looked at often, especially on hard days. William began opening up more about his feelings. Instead of hiding behind work, he started talking to Catherine when sadness overwhelmed him. They developed a system of checking in with each other. A simple question of "How are you really feeling?" became a daily ritual that kept them connected. They also started a new family tradition. Every week they would share their favorite memory of the person they lost. Sometimes the memories were funny. Sometimes they were touching. Sometimes they made everyone cry. But always, they brought the loved one's spirit back into the room. The first major holiday without their loved one was incredibly difficult. Catherine dreaded it for weeks. The empty seat at the table, the missing voice in conversations, the traditions that wouldn't feel the same. She considered canceling everything, but William convinced her the children needed normalcy. The day arrived, and it was as hard as Catherine feared. But it was also beautiful in its own way. They told stories. They toasted to their loved one's memory. They cried together and laughed together. It wasn't the same as before, but it was okay. Different didn't have to mean bad. George gave a little speech that made everyone emotional. He said that even though someone was missing from their celebration, they were still there in spirit, that the love they shared hadn't gone away just because the person had. His maturity and wisdom amazed everyone. As winter turned to spring, Catherine noticed small changes in herself. The heavy feeling in her chest wasn't as constant. She could think about happy memories without immediately crying. She could see the future as something other than just endless sadness. Healing was happening slowly but surely. She also noticed changes in William. He smiled more genuinely. He took time to just be with the family instead of always working. He talked about the person they lost with fondness instead of only pain. They were both learning to carry their grief differently. The children were resilient in the way only children can be. They still had moments of sadness and confusion. Charlotte sometimes cried at bedtime. George had nightmares occasionally. Louis asked innocent questions that broke hearts. But they also laughed and played and found joy in everyday moments. Catherine and William made sure to answer every question the children had. They never dismissed their feelings or told them to be strong. They created a home where it was safe to be sad, to be angry, to be confused, where grief was acknowledged and accepted. One beautiful spring morning, the family returned to the gardens, to that same bench under the large tree where they had sat in the early days of their grief. The garden looked different now. Flowers were blooming everywhere. The tree had new leaves. Everything spoke of renewal and life continuing. They sat together as they had before, but this time felt different. The sadness was still there, woven into who they were now, but it didn't consume them anymore. They could feel sad and grateful at the same time. could miss someone and still embrace life fully. Charlotte picked a flower and held it up to the sky. She said it was for the person they missed, wherever they were now. George added that he thought they were probably watching over them all the time. Louis just smiled his innocent smile, content to be with his family. Catherine looked at William and he looked back at her. Without words, they acknowledged how far they had come. From those first impossible days of fresh grief to this moment of peace mixed with sadness. It hadn't been easy. There had been so many dark days. But they had made it through together. William put his arm around Catherine. She leaned her head on his shoulder. The children gathered close. They sat there as a family, remembering and honoring someone they loved while also embracing the life they still had ahead of them. Catherine realized something profound in that moment. Grief never really ended. You didn't get over loss. You learned to carry it. It became part of you, woven into your story. But it didn't have to define you or stop you from living fully. The person they lost had taught them so much about love and family. Those lessons didn't die with them. Instead, they lived on through the values instilled, the memories shared, the love that continued to connect them all. Death had taken away a presence, but it couldn't touch the impact of a life that had been lived with love. As they walked back to the palace together, Catherine felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not for the pain to disappear because she knew it never fully would, but hope that they would continue to heal, that joy would return more and more, that life would feel worth living again. The children ran ahead laughing and playing. Catherine watched them with tears in her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude. Grateful for the time they had with the person they lost, grateful for the family she still had, grateful for the strength to keep going even when it felt impossible. William squeezed her hand. She looked up at him and saw the same gratitude reflected in his eyes. They had survived the worst. They had said their tearful goodbye. They had walked through the valley of grief together. And now, slowly, they were finding their way back to light. The journey wasn't over. There would still be hard days ahead. Anniversaries and birthdays that brought fresh pain. Moments when the loss felt overwhelming again. But Catherine knew they could face it. They had proven they were strong enough. Together, as a family bound by love and shared loss, they could face anything. As the sun set over the palace gardens, casting everything in golden light, Catherine whispered a promise to the person they had lost. A promise to live fully in their honor, to raise the children with love, to find joy even in sorrow, to never forget but also to keep moving forward. Life would never be the same as it was before. But different didn't have to mean worse. It just meant learning a new way to live, a way that honored the past while embracing the future, a way that held on to love even when the person you loved was no longer physically present. And so the family continued their journey. Through grief and healing, through tears and laughter, through the pain of goodbye and the hope of tomorrow. Together, always together, they carried forward the legacy of love they had been given. Honey,